50 years ago, America poured billions into Vietnam. Helicopters, rifles, endless firepower. We promised victory. We got humiliation. Today we're repeating that same playbook in Ukraine. Advanced missiles, cutting-edge jets, satellite intel. Different wars, same mistakes. Here's the shocking part. Vietnam tried to teach us 3 lessons about proxy wars, enemy motivation, and how wars really end. We ignored every single one. So ask yourself, if the smartest generals from Vietnam could see Ukraine today, what would they say? Stay with me, because once you see the patterns, you'll realize this war may already have a script written decades ago. Let me start with a story that explains everything wrong with our Ukraine strategy. 1967, South Vietnam. General William Westmoreland has just received the latest shipment of American military aid. Advanced helicopters, modern rifles, sophisticated communications equipment. On paper, South Vietnamese forces now have technology superior to anything the North Vietnamese possess. Westmoreland is confident. Victory is just months away. But there's a problem nobody wants to acknowledge. All this advanced equipment requires American technicians to maintain it, American advisors to operate it, American intelligence to direct it, and American political will to sustain it. By 1975, when Congress finally cut funding, South Vietnamese forces couldn't maintain their own equipment. They couldn't operate their own intelligence networks. They couldn't sustain their own war effort. 8 years of American aid had created dependence, not strength. Fast forward to 2024. Ukraine has received HIMARS systems, Patriot missiles, F-16 fighters, and advanced satellite intelligence. Ukrainian forces are achieving impressive tactical victories, but here's the uncomfortable truth. They're completely dependent on American maintenance, American intelligence, and American political will. Vietnam's first lesson was simple. Proxy wars don't create independent allies. They create permanent dependence. The more advanced weapons you provide, the more your ally needs you to keep fighting. It's not building their strength, it's building your responsibility. But we ignored that lesson. Instead of learning that proxy support creates endless obligation, we convinced ourselves that more advanced weapons would somehow create less dependence. We told ourselves that this time would be different. Here's what Vietnam should have taught us. Successful proxy support focuses on sustainability, not capability. Give your ally weapons they can maintain themselves. Provide training they can replicate themselves. Create supply chains they can sustain themselves. Instead, we're repeating the exact same pattern. Ukraine's most effective weapons require American satellite data, American maintenance crews, and American spare parts. When American support eventually decreases, and it always does, what happens to Ukraine's ability to defend itself? Vietnam veterans watching this war recognize the signs immediately. We should have learned to ask different questions. Can Ukraine maintain these weapons in 5 years? Can they produce their own ammunition? Can they sustain this fight without American intelligence satellites? Instead, we're asking the same questions we asked in Vietnam. How can we give them better weapons? How can we provide more support? How can we help them win faster? Vietnam already answered those questions. The answer was failure. Here's the second lesson Vietnam tried to teach us, and it's the most important one. 1968, after the Tet Offensive, American intelligence officers are analyzing captured North Vietnamese documents. What they find should have changed everything. These weren't soldiers fighting for communist ideology or Soviet expansion. They were fighting for something much more dangerous: national survival. One captured diary entry from a North Vietnamese soldier read, "The Americans have better weapons and more bombs. But this is our home. They have to go home eventually. We are already home." American strategists consistently misunderstood what motivated their enemy. We thought we were fighting communist expansion. We thought superior firepower would convince rational actors to negotiate. We thought we were dealing with a proxy war where Moscow was calling the shots. But North Vietnam was fighting an existential war for national independence. When your enemy believes their survival is at stake, they don't calculate costs like we do. They don't make rational decisions about acceptable losses. They fight until they win or cease to exist. Fast forward to today. Russia isn't fighting for territorial expansion or Soviet restoration. Putin has convinced his population, and more importantly, his military leadership, that they're fighting for Russian national survival. Whether that's true doesn't matter. What matters is they believe it. In Vietnam, we consistently underestimated North Vietnamese resolve because we projected our own motivations onto them. We thought they were fighting for the same limited political objectives we were. We thought massive bombing campaigns would convince them to negotiate, because that's what would convince us. But they weren't fighting our kind of war. They were fighting a war of national survival. And people fighting for survival don't surrender because of bombing campaigns. They dig deeper bunkers. The lesson Vietnam tried to teach us: understand your enemy's motivation before you choose your strategy. If they're fighting for survival and you're fighting for policy objectives, you need a fundamentally different approach. Russia today believes, or has convinced itself, that NATO expansion represents an existential threat to Russian civilization. Whether we agree with that assessment is irrelevant. Strategic planning based on what we think should motivate them, rather than what actually motivates them, leads to the same miscalculations we made in Vietnam. Vietnam veterans understand this instinctively. They fought an enemy that wouldn't quit because they couldn't quit. The North Vietnamese weren't weighing cost-benefit analyses of continued fighting. They were fighting for their national existence. If we had learned this lesson, our Ukraine strategy would focus less on degrading Russian military capability and more on changing Russian perception of what they're fighting for. Because you can't defeat an enemy who believes they're fighting for survival by simply making that fight more expensive. You have to convince them they're not actually fighting for survival, or you have to be prepared for a very long war. The third lesson Vietnam tried to teach us is the most uncomfortable. Proxy wars don't end the way you think they end. January 1973. Henry Kissinger signs the Paris Peace Accords, officially ending American involvement in Vietnam. President Nixon calls it peace with honor, but every serious person in that room knows the truth. America is abandoning South Vietnam while pretending otherwise. The uncomfortable lesson Vietnam taught us: proxy wars don't end with victory parades or surrender ceremonies. They end when the distant superpower gets tired of supporting their proxy. And when that support ends, the proxy usually loses. This isn't cynicism, it's historical pattern. Korea ended in stalemate after American voters tired of casualties. Vietnam ended with South Vietnamese collapse after Congress cut funding. Afghanistan ended with government collapse after America withdrew support. Ukraine is following the identical pattern: initial strong support, impressive early victories, then gradual decline in American enthusiasm as costs mount and other priorities emerge. The only question is timing. Vietnam should have taught us to plan proxy interventions with realistic exit strategies from day one. Not how do we help them win, but how do we help them survive when we inevitably reduce support? Instead, we make the same promises we made to South Vietnam. We'll support you as long as it takes. American commitment is unwavering. We'll never abandon our allies. But America always reduces support eventually. It's not betrayal, it's democracy. Voters get tired. Costs mount. New crises emerge. That's how democratic foreign policy works. Vietnam tried to teach us to build proxy relationships that could survive American political cycles. Help your ally develop capabilities they can sustain independently. Create regional coalitions that don't depend entirely on American support. Plan for the inevitable reduction in American involvement. The most tragic part about Ukraine is how predictable the ending becomes once you understand this pattern. Strong initial American support will gradually decline. European allies will reduce their contributions as economic costs mount. Russia will outlast Western political commitment because autocracies don't face electoral cycles. This doesn't mean Ukraine is doomed, but it means successful Ukrainian strategy must account for eventual reduction in Western support. Vietnam should have taught us to help our allies prepare for that reality from the beginning. Vietnam tried to teach us that proxy wars are different from direct wars. They require different strategies, different timelines, and different definitions of success. We ignored those lessons because they were uncomfortable. Now Ukraine is learning the same lessons Vietnam learned 50 years ago. The only question is whether we'll finally listen this time, or whether we'll keep repeating the same mistakes until history forces us to learn. The choice is ours, but the patterns are already written.